The screams echoed through the dense Oregon forest at 3:47 a.m., piercing the summer silence like a knife through silk. But by the time Camp Pine Hollow's night watchman, old Pete Morrison, stumbled out of his cabin with a flashlight in hand, there was nothing but the whisper of wind through ancient pines and the distant hoot of an owl. It was the summer of 2006, and 12-year-old Jacob Foster was about to become the ghost that would haunt these woods for the next 18 years. Jacob had arrived at Camp Pine Hollow 3 days earlier, his worn paperback copy of The Giver tucked under his arm and his bright blue Nike sneakers still pristine from the department store. His parents, Daniel and Melissa Foster, had driven him up from Portland in their aging Honda Civic, hope written across their faces like a prayer. Their quiet, bookish son needed this, needed friends, needed confidence, needed something to pull him out of the shell he'd built around himself. "You'll love it here, sweetheart," Melissa had whispered as she kissed his forehead goodbye, her voice carrying the weight of every parent's desperate wish for their child's happiness. But Jacob wasn't so sure. As he watched his parents' car disappear down the winding mountain road, he felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. Around him, other kids were already forming groups, their laughter sharp and exclusive. He clutched his book tighter and made his way toward Cabin 7, where he'd been assigned to bunk with 3 other boys. His bunkmates were everything Jacob wasn't: confident, athletic, loud. There was Marcus Chun, whose father owned a chain of sporting goods stores, and who seemed to have every piece of camping equipment known to mankind. Tommy Rodriguez was the joker, quick with a smile, and quicker with a prank. And then there was Kyle Morrison. Yes, related to the night watchman, a tall, gangly kid with piercing blue eyes and a habit of staring just a little too long at everything around him. "So what's your thing?" Marcus asked on the first night as they all settled into their bunks. "I'm here for the rock climbing. Tommy's doing the comedy workshop. Kyle's weird, but he's cool." Jacob felt his cheeks burn. "I like to read, and I'm good with electronics, I guess." "Electronics?" Tommy laughed, not unkindly. "Dude, we're in the middle of nowhere. There's no Wi-Fi, no cell service, no nothing. You might as well have brought a spaceship." But Kyle leaned forward from his top bunk, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "I bet you could fix things, though. Right? Like, if something broke, you could figure it out." There was something in Kyle's voice that made Jacob look up, something that sounded almost eager. But before he could respond, their counselor, a college-aged guy named Brad Stevens, stuck his head into the cabin. "Lights out, gentlemen. Big day tomorrow. We're hiking the Blue Spruce Trail." The Blue Spruce Trail. Jacob would remember that name for the rest of his life, however long that would be. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of Pacific Northwest summer day that made you believe in magic. The camp was a bustling hive of activity as kids prepared for their various adventures. Jacob found himself assigned to the intermediate hiking group, led by Brad and assisted by Sarah Chun, Marcus's older sister, who was working as a junior counselor. Sarah was 19, studying environmental science at Oregon State, and had the kind of easy confidence that Jacob envied. She seemed to know every bird by its call, every tree by its bark, every rock formation by its geological history. More importantly, she was kind to Jacob in a way that didn't feel like pity. "You know," she said as they gathered their gear, "some of the best naturalists I know started out as quiet observers. They saw things other people missed." Jacob smiled shyly. It was the first time in days he'd felt like maybe he belonged here. The hiking group consisted of 8 kids, plus Brad and Sarah. Besides Jacob, Marcus, Tommy, and Kyle, there were 2 girls from Seattle, Emma and Zoe, and a pair of brothers from Bend named Alex and Connor Walsh. The Walsh brothers were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and communicating in a language of glances and gestures that Jacob found both fascinating and isolating. As they set off down the main trail, Jacob hung back, listening to Brad's commentary about the local ecosystem. The forest was stunning, towering Douglas firs and western red cedars that seemed to scrape the sky, their trunks so wide that it would take several kids holding hands to encircle them. Shafts of sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating pools of golden light on the forest floor. The Blue Spruce Trail was originally a Native American hunting path, Brad explained as they walked. The Malala people used it for generations before settlers arrived. Some say it's still sacred ground. Kyle caught up to Jacob, his footsteps eerily silent on the soft earth. "You believe in that stuff?" he asked quietly. "Sacred ground?" Jacob shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe. Why? My grandpa, Pete, the night watchman, he's got stories about these woods. Says there are places where the boundary between worlds gets thin. Places where things ... happen." Before Jacob could ask what he meant, Sarah called out from up ahead. "Trail junction coming up. We're taking the fork to the left. That's the Blue Spruce proper. The right fork leads to some old cabins, but they're off limits. Been abandoned for decades." Jacob glanced down the Forbidden's path. It looked darker somehow, the trees closer together, the underbrush thicker. For just a moment, he thought he saw movement in the shadows, a flash of white, like clothing or pale skin. But when he looked again, there was nothing. The hike continued, without incident for the first hour. The kids chatted and laughed, their voices echoing off the trees. Sarah pointed out various plants and animals, while Brad regaled them with stories of his own camping adventures. Jacob found himself relaxing, even joining in the conversation when Tommy made jokes about the various weird sounds coming from the forest. But as they reached the halfway point, a small clearing with a view of the distant mountains, the mood began to shift. The sky, which had been brilliantly blue, was now streaked with gray clouds. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and the wind had picked up, making the trees creak and groan like old bones. "Weather's changing," Brad said, checking his watch. "We should probably think about heading back." But as they gathered their packs, Emma suddenly grabbed Sarah's arm. "Did you hear that?" They all fell silent, listening. At first, it was only the wind and the rustle of leaves. Then, faintly, came the sound of crying, a child's voice, high and desperate, echoing through the trees. "Hello?" Sarah called out. "Is someone there?" The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press against their eardrums. "Probably just an animal," Brad said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Sometimes foxes sound almost human." Kyle was staring intently into the forest, his blue eyes wide. "It came from the old cabin trail," he whispered. "The one we're not supposed to go down." "Well, we're not going down it," Brad said firmly. "We're heading back to camp, now." But as they started back down the trail, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow seemed to conceal a presence, every rustling. Bush might hide someone, or something, waiting to pounce. He found himself falling behind the group, his eyes darting nervously from tree to tree. It was then that he saw her. A girl, maybe his age, standing just off the trail, about 50 yards ahead. She was wearing a dirty white dress and had long, dark hair that hung in tangled strands around her face. She was staring directly at him, her mouth moving as if she was saying something, but no sound reached his ears. Jacob stopped walking, his heart hammering in his chest. The girl raised her hand and pointed, not at him, but behind him, toward the Forbidden's trail. "Hey!" Jacob called out, his voice cracking. "Are you okay?" The girl's eyes widened, and she shook her head violently. Then she turned and ran, disappearing into the trees like smoke. "Jacob!" Sarah's voice cut through his shock. "What are you doing? Come on." Jacob looked back at the group, all of them staring at him with expressions ranging from confusion to concern. When he turned back to where the girl had been, there was nothing, just trees and shadows and the whisper of wind. "I thought I saw someone," he stammered. "Who?" Brad asked, jogging back toward him. "A girl. She was wearing a white dress." She pointed toward the old cabin trail. Brad and Sarah exchanged glances. "There's no one else on the trail today," Sarah said gently. "Sometimes the light plays tricks on you in the forest." But Kyle was beside Jacob now, his face pale. "What did she look like?" he asked urgently. Jacob described the girl, her age, her dress, her dark hair. With each detail, Kyle's expression grew more troubled. "Kyle," Sarah asked, "what is it?" Kyle shook his head. "Nothing. Just, we should get back to camp." The hike back was tense, everyone jumping at every sound. The clouds had thickened, and the first drops of rain were beginning to fall. By the time they reached Camp Pine Hollow, it was pouring, and the kids scattered to their cabins like leaves before a storm. That evening, as the rain drummed against the roof of Cabin 7, Jacob found himself unable to concentrate on his book. He kept thinking about the girl in the white dress, about the way she'd pointed toward the Forbidden's trail, about the desperate look in her eyes. "Hey, Kyle," he said quietly, knowing the other boys were asleep. "You know something about that girl, don't you?" Kyle's bunk creaked as he shifted. For a long moment, Jacob thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, so quietly Jacob had to strain. To hear him, Kyle began to speak. 5 years ago, there was another girl at camp. Her name was Annie Delacroix. She was 12, like us, from Portland, like you. Kyle's voice was barely a whisper. She went missing on the Blue Spruce Trail. They found her 3 days later, but she was different. She wouldn't talk about what happened. Just kept saying she'd been playing with the other children in the woods. Jacob felt a chill run down his spine. Other children? That's what she said. But there weren't any other children missing. The camp administrators figured she'd hit her head or something. Got confused. But Annie ... She was never the same after that. Her parents took her home early, and she spent the rest of the summer in therapy. What do you think happened to her? Kyle was quiet for so long that Jacob thought he'd fallen asleep. Then, "I think she found something in these woods. Something that's been here longer than the camp, longer than the town. Something that's still looking for playmates." The next day dawned gray and overcast, the storm having passed, but leaving the forest damp and eerily quiet. During breakfast, Jacob noticed that several of the counselors were in deep conversation with the camp director, a weathered man named Robert Thorne, who'd been running Pine Hollow for over 20 years. Sarah looked worried when she sat down with her breakfast tray. "Everything okay?" Jacob asked. She glanced around, then leaned closer. "One of the other groups found something weird yesterday. Old Pete was doing his rounds near the abandoned cabins and found fresh footprints in the mud, small ones, like a child's. But all the kids were accounted for." Jacob's blood ran cold. "What kind of footprints?" "Barefoot. And they led from the cabins toward the main camp." Sarah paused. "Director Thorne is talking about restricting access to the outer trails until they figure out what's going on." But before she could say more, a scream split the morning air. Not the playful shriek of children at play, but a sound of pure terror that made everyone in the dining hall freeze. It was coming from the direction of the Blue Spruce Trail. Within minutes, the camp was in chaos. Counselors were doing rapid head counts, trying to figure out if anyone was missing. Parents were being called. Search teams were being organized. And in the middle of it all, Jacob sat frozen at his table, Kyle's words echoing in his mind. something that's still looking for playmates. The scream, as it turned out, had come from Alex Walsh, the younger of the two brothers from Bend. He and Connor had snuck out early to explore the forest, a direct violation of camp rules, and had gotten as far as the trail junction when Alex claimed he saw something that made him panic. There was a girl, he kept saying, his voice shaking as Director Thorne questioned him. She was floating above the ground, just floating there, and her eyes ... her eyes were black. Completely black. Connor, who was normally the more vocal of the two, had gone completely silent. He sat beside his brother, staring at nothing, his face pale as paper. "Where exactly did you see this girl?" Thorne asked, his voice patient, but strained. Alex pointed toward the blue spruce trail with a trembling finger, right where it forks. She was standing, floating, right in the middle of the path. And she was pointing down the old cabin trail. Jacob felt his heart skip a beat. The same place, the same gesture. Did she say anything? Thorne pressed. Alex shook his head, but Connor suddenly spoke up, his voice barely audible. She said, "Come, play with us." The dining hall fell silent. Even the youngest campers seemed to sense that something was terribly wrong. Director Thorne stood up, his face grim. "All outdoor activities are suspended until further notice. Everyone stays in there. Cabins unless accompanied by a counselor. No exceptions." As the campers were herded back to their cabins, Jacob felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Kyle, his blue eyes intense. "We need to talk," Kyle whispered. "Tonight, after lights out." The rest of the day passed in a haze of whispered conversations and nervous glances. The counselors tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy with indoor activities, board games, arts and crafts, storytelling, but the tension was palpable. Jacob couldn't concentrate on anything. He kept thinking about the girl in the white dress, about Annie Delacroix, about the floating figure Alex had described. That night, after Brad had made his final rounds and the cabin was quiet, Kyle crept down from his bunk and shook Jacob awake. "Come on," he whispered. "We're going to see my grandpa." They slipped out of the cabin and made their way through the darkened camp. The moon was just a sliver, providing barely enough light to see by. Every shadow seemed to writhe and move, and Jacob found himself jumping at every sound. Pete Morrison's cabin was at the far edge of the camp, a small weathered structure that looked like it had been there since the beginning of time. Smoke was curling from the chimney, and warm light spilled from the windows. Kyle knocked softly on the door. "Grandpa?" "It's me." The door opened to reveal a man in his 70s, with wild gray hair and eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. Pete Morrison looked at his grandson, then at Jacob, and nodded as if he'd been expecting them. "Come in, boys. We have things to discuss." The interior of the cabin was like stepping into another world. Every surface was covered with artifacts, Native American pottery, old photographs, strange symbols carved into pieces of wood. The air smelled of sage and something else, something earthy and ancient. "You've seen her, haven't you?" Pete said without preamble, settling into a worn armchair. "The girl in the white dress," Jacob nodded, unable to speak. Pete sighed heavily. "I was hoping it wouldn't start again. But I suppose 20 years is long enough for people to forget." "Forget what?" Kyle asked, the last time she appeared. Pete's eyes grew distant. 1986. A little girl named Rebecca Murphy went missing from the camp. They found her body 3 days later at the bottom of Silver Lake. Drowned, they said. But Rebecca was an excellent swimmer. Had been taking lessons since she was 4. Jacob found his voice. "You think the girl in the white dress killed her?" "I think," Pete said slowly, "that Rebecca became the girl in the white dress. And now she's looking for company." The old man stood up, and moved to a shelf, pulling down a leather-bound journal. This camp was built on cursed ground, boys. The Malala people knew it. They had stories about this place, stories about children who disappeared into the forest and never came back. But they also had stories about the children who did come back, changed into something else. He opened the journal, revealing pages covered in faded handwriting and old photographs. "I've been keeping records for 40 years. Every unexplained disappearance, every strange sighting, every death." He turned to a page near the middle. "Look at this." The photograph showed a group of children from what looked like the 1960s, all smiling at the camera. But one face had been circled in red ink, a young girl with dark hair and a white dress. "Susan Blackwood," Pete said, "disappeared in 1967, found dead a week later, allegedly from a fall. But witnesses reported seeing her walking through the camp for months afterward." He flipped to another page. "Maria Santos, 1978, vanished during a thunderstorm. Body found in the lake, but the coroner said she'd been dead for weeks, not days." Page after page, story after story. A pattern of disappearances, deaths, and sightings that stretched back decades. "They all become part of her," Pete said quietly. "The girl in the white dress. She collects them, one by one, building her own little community in the space between the living and the dead." Jacob felt sick. But why? What does she want? "What any child wants," Pete replied. "Friends, family, people who will never leave her alone. How do we stop her?" Kyle asked. Pete closed the journal and looked at them both with sad eyes. "You can't stop her, boys. You can only avoid her. Stay away from the Blue Spruce Trail. Stay away from the old cabins. And whatever you do, don't let her touch you." But even as he spoke, Jacob felt a strange pull, as if something was calling to him from the depths of the forest. He looked out the window, and there, just at the edge of the tree line, he saw a flash of white. The girl was there, watching them. And she was smiling. The next morning brought chaos. Emma, one of the girls from the hiking group, was missing. Her bunkmate, Zoe, said she'd been there when they went to sleep, but her bed was empty when they woke up. A search was organized immediately, but as the hours passed with no sign of her, the mood in the camp grew increasingly desperate. Jacob volunteered to help with the search, partly out of genuine concern for Emma, but mostly because he couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow connected to what was happening. He was assigned to a team led by Sarah, searching the area around the dining hall and main buildings. "This is so strange," Sarah said as they combed through the camp. Emma was such a practical girl. She wouldn't just wander off, especially not after what happened with the Walsh brothers. But Jacob was barely listening. His attention was focused on the forest, on the shadows between the trees, on the feeling that they were being watched. Every few minutes, he caught glimpses of movement, a flash of white, a pale face, a beckoning hand. But when he looked directly, there was nothing there. It was Kyle who found the first real clue. He came running up to the search team, his face pale with excitement and fear. "I found something," he panted. "Emma's bracelet. It was on the Blue Spruce Trail, right? At the junction." The bracelet was a simple silver chain with a small heart charm, something Emma had worn every day since arriving at camp. But it wasn't just lying on the ground. It was hanging from a branch, as if it had been deliberately placed there. "She went down the old cabin trail," Kyle said quietly, "just like they wanted her to." Director Thorne made the decision to call in the authorities. Within hours, the camp was crawling with police officers, search and rescue teams, and volunteers. From the nearby town, parents were called, and several arrived to take their children home immediately. Jacob's parents were among them. He saw their Honda Civic pulling up the camp road and felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. He wanted to go home, to get away from the girl in the white dress and the strange pull he felt toward the forest. But he also felt like he was abandoning Emma, leaving her to whatever fate awaited her in the woods. "Thank God you're safe," his mother said, crushing him in a hug. "We were so worried when we heard about the missing girl." "I'm fine, Mom," Jacob said, but even as he spoke, he was looking over her shoulder at the forest. And there, just barely visible among the trees, he saw Emma. She was wearing the same clothes she'd had on yesterday, but her face was pale, and her eyes were dark. She was standing next to the girl in the white dress, and they were both staring directly at him. Emma raised her hand and waved. The gesture was cheerful, normal, but there was something wrong with it, something mechanical, as if she was being controlled like a puppet. "Jacob?" his father asked. "What are you looking at?" Jacob blinked, and when he looked again, the girls were gone. "Nothing," he said quietly. "Just nothing." But as they drove away from Camp Pine Hollow, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaving something unfinished. He pressed his face against the car window, watching the forest recede, and just before they turned the corner, he saw her one more time. The girl in the white dress was standing in the middle of the road, her dark hair flowing in an unfelt breeze. She was holding something in her hands, a pair of bright blue sneakers, just like the ones Jacob was wearing, and she was smiling. The drive home was quiet, his parents occasionally asking gentle questions about his time at camp. Jacob answered as best he could, but he found it difficult to focus on the conversation. His mind kept drifting back to the forest, to the girl in the white dress, to the feeling that something was calling him back. That night, alone in his room in Portland, Jacob tried to convince himself that it had all been his imagination. The stress of being at camp, the strange stories Kyle had told him, the power of suggestion. It all made sense in the rational light of his bedroom, surrounded by his books and electronics. But when he closed his eyes, he saw her face. And when he opened them, he could swear he smelled pine trees and damp earth. The next few days passed in a blur of news reports and phone calls. Emma's disappearance had made the local news, and reporters were calling Camp Pine Hollow a scene of tragedy. The camp announced that it would be closing for the remainder of the summer, and Director Thorne gave a statement about the need for a complete review of safety protocols. Jacob's parents were sympathetic, but firm. He would not be returning to camp, not this summer, not ever. They enrolled him in a day program at the local community center, where he spent his remaining summer days reading and helping with the computer lab. But at night, he dreamed of the forest. In his dreams, he walked the blue spruce trail again and again, always ending up at the junction where the forbidden path led to the old cabins. Sometimes he saw Emma there, her face pale and her eyes dark, beckoning him to follow. Sometimes it was the girl in the white dress, holding his blue sneakers like a promise. And sometimes, in the worst dreams, he saw himself, older, paler, standing among a group of children who didn't quite look alive, all of them waiting for the next young camper to join their eternal game. 2 weeks after he returned home, Jacob received a package in the mail. There was no return address, just his name and address written in a childish scrawl. Inside was a photograph, the same group photo Pete Morrison had shown him, but this time there was a new face circled in red ink. Emma. And written on the back, in the same childish handwriting, were 4 words: "Come play with us." Jacob showed the photograph to his parents, who immediately called the police. The authorities were interested, but ultimately baffled. There was no way to trace the package, and the photograph could have been doctored by anyone with basic computer skills. But Jacob knew it was real, just as he knew that the girl in the white dress was still out there, still waiting, still collecting friends for her eternal game. As summer faded into autumn, Jacob tried to return to his normal life. He went back to school, made decent grades, even joined the computer club. But he never forgot about Camp Pine Hollow, about Emma, about the girl in the white dress. And late at night, when the city was quiet and the shadows were long, he could swear he heard her voice calling his name. The years passed. Jacob grew up, went to college, started a career in computer programming. He married a woman named Lisa, had 2 children of his own. He rarely spoke about his experience at Camp Pine Hollow, even to his wife. It seemed like something from another life, a childhood nightmare that had lost its power over him. But in 2024, 18 years after that fateful summer, Jacob received a phone call that changed everything. "Is this Jacob Foster?" the voice on the other end asked. "Yes, this is Jacob. Mr. Foster, this is Detective Sarah Chun with the Oregon State Police. I believe you attended Camp Pine Hollow in 2006. Jacob felt his blood run cold. Sarah Chun, the same Sarah who had been his counselor, who had tried to protect him from the mysteries of the forest. "Yes," he said slowly. "I was there. Mr. Foster, I need to ask you to come to Oregon. We've found something that might be connected to your time at the camp." The drive to Oregon was surreal. Jacob's wife had wanted to come with him, but he'd insisted on going alone. He couldn't explain why, just that this was something he needed to face by himself. Sarah Chun was waiting for him at the Oregon State Police headquarters in Salem. She was 37 now, her hair shorter and her face more serious, but he recognized her immediately. "Jacob," she said, shaking his hand, "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." "What did you find?" he asked without preamble. Sarah led him to a conference room where a box of evidence sat on the table. 3 weeks ago, a construction crew was clearing the old Camp Pine Hollow site. They're planning to build a new resort there. While they were demolishing one of the old cabins, one that had been abandoned even when the camp was running, they found something. She opened the box and pulled out a plastic evidence bag. Inside was a pair of shoes, bright blue Nike sneakers, aged and dirty, but still recognizable. Jacob's heart stopped. "Those are mine." "Are you sure? Positive?" "My parents bought them for my birthday that year. They were my favorite shoes." He looked up at Sarah. "But I wore them home." "I still have them in my closet." Sarah nodded grimly. "That's what we thought you'd say. The thing is, these shoes were found buried under the floorboards of the cabin, along with several other items." She pulled out more evidence bags. "A bracelet that matches the description of the one Emma Morrison was wearing when she disappeared. A toy that belonged to a boy who went missing in 1978. And this." The final item was a photograph, old and faded, but still clearly visible. It showed a group of children standing in front of a cabin, all of them smiling at the camera. But their smiles were wrong somehow, too wide, too knowing. And in the center of the group, wearing a white dress, was the girl Jacob remembered from his nightmares. "We think this cabin was some kind of collection point," Sarah said. "A place where someone was keeping trophies from missing children. The question is who and why." Jacob stared at the photograph, his mind racing. "Have you talked to Pete Morrison? Kyle's grandfather?" "Pete Morrison died 5 years ago. Kyle moved to Alaska after college. But we've been trying to reach him." "What? About the other children? The ones who saw the girl in the white dress?" Sarah's expression grew even more serious. "That's the strange part. We've tracked down everyone who was at camp that summer. The Walsh brothers, Tommy Rodriguez, Marcus Chun, my brother. They all remember the sightings, but they all say the same thing. They never saw the girl clearly. It was always just glimpses. Shadows, things that might have been tricks of the light. But I saw her," Jacob said, "clear as day, multiple times." "We know. And according to our investigation, you were the only one who reported detailed sightings." The only one who seemed to have direct contact with whatever was in those woods. Jacob felt a chill run down his spine. What are you saying? We're saying that you might be the key to understanding what happened at Camp Pine Hollow, and we're hoping you'll help us find the truth. The next morning, Jacob found himself standing at the edge of what had once been Camp Pine Hollow. Construction crew had cleared most of the site, but a few of the old cabins remained, including the one where his shoes had been found. The forest was different now. Older, darker, more oppressive. The trees seemed to lean in closer, and the shadows were deeper. But the feeling was the same, that sense of being watched, of being called to something deeper in the woods. Sarah walked beside him, along with 2 other detectives and a crime scene photographer. They were all armed, though Jacob wasn't sure what good guns would do against whatever lived in these woods. The cabin is about a 1/4 mile down this path, Sarah said, pointing toward a barely visible trail. Are you ready for this? Jacob nodded, though he wasn't sure he'd ever be ready. As they walked, he found himself looking for familiar landmarks. The junction where the blue spruce trail met the old cabin path, the clearing where he'd first seen the girl in the white dress. Everything was overgrown now, reclaimed by the forest. But the bones of the old camp were still there, hidden beneath layers of vegetation and time. The cabin, when they reached it, was in worse shape than Jacob had expected. The roof had partially collapsed, and the walls were covered in moss and decay. But it was definitely the same structure he remembered from his nightmares. The place where the girl in the white dress had always seemed to be leading him. This is it, Sarah said, pulling on latex gloves. The shoes were found in the northeast corner, under what used to be the floorboards. Jacob followed her inside, his heart pounding. The interior was dark and damp, with shafts of sunlight streaming through holes in the roof. The air smelled of rot and something else, something sweet and cloying that made his stomach turn. Here, Sarah said, shining her flashlight on a section of exposed dirt where the floorboards had been removed. This is where we found the items. Jacob knelt down, staring at the shallow depression in the earth. It was just a hole in the ground, but something about it made his skin crawl. It looked almost like a grave. How deep did you dig? He asked. About 3 feet. We stopped when we hit bedrock. But Jacob was already pulling out his phone, activating the flashlight app. He shined it into the hole, looking for. He wasn't sure what. Some sign, some clue, some evidence of what had really happened here. And then he saw it, carved into the bedrock at the bottom of the hole. Almost invisible unless you knew what to look for, was a symbol. It looked like a circle with several smaller circles around it, connected by thin lines. It was crude, as if it had been scratched into the stone with a nail or a piece of metal. Sarah, he said quietly, look at this. She leaned over his shoulder, following the beam of his flashlight. What is it? I don't know, but I've seen it before. And he had. In Pete Morrison's cabin, carved into pieces of wood. In his dreams, scratched into trees and stones. It was a symbol that had haunted him for 18 years, though he'd never consciously remembered it until now. We need to document this, Sarah said, calling over the photographer. And we need to find out what it means. But Jacob was already backing away from the hole, his mind racing. He knew what it meant, deep down in a part of his consciousness. That had been locked away for nearly 2 decades. It was a summoning circle, a way of calling the girl in the white dress, of opening the door between the world of the living and whatever dark realm she inhabited, and someone had been using it. We need to leave, he said urgently. Now. What? Why? Because she's coming. Even as he spoke, Jacob felt the familiar pull, the sense of being drawn deeper into the forest. The shadows in the cabin seemed to be moving, shifting, coalescing into familiar shapes. And from somewhere in the distance came the sound of children laughing. "Who's coming?" Sarah asked, but her voice seemed to come from very far away. Jacob looked up, and there she was, the girl in the white dress, standing in the doorway of the cabin. She looked exactly the same as she had 18 years ago, pale, young, with dark hair and eyes that held the wisdom of ages. But she wasn't alone. Behind her stood Emma, still wearing the same clothes she'd had on the day she disappeared. Next to Emma was a boy Jacob didn't recognize, probably from one of the earlier disappearances. And behind them, barely visible in the shadows, were more children, dozens of them, all pale and still, all watching him with dark, knowing eyes. "Hello." "Jacob," the girl in the white dress said, her voice echoing strangely in the small space. "We've been waiting for you." Jacob tried to speak, but no words came out. His throat felt constricted, as if invisible hands were squeezing the air from his lungs. He could hear Sarah calling his name, but her voice seemed to come from another dimension entirely. "You left us," the girl in the white dress continued, stepping closer. "You were supposed to come with us that night. You were supposed to join our family." Jacob found his voice. "I was just a kid. I didn't understand. You understood perfectly." Emma stepped forward, and Jacob could see that her face was wrong somehow, too pale, too still, as if she was a photograph of herself rather than a living person. "You saw us. You heard us calling. But you chose to leave." "The shoes," Jacob whispered, finally understanding. "You took my shoes to keep part of me here." The girl in the white dress smiled, and for a moment her face flickered, revealing something ancient and terrible beneath the childlike facade. "We take what we need. A shoe, a bracelet, a toy. Little pieces of the children who slip away from us. And eventually, those pieces call them back." Around the cabin, the other children began to move, their forms becoming more solid, more real. Jacob could see their faces clearly now, some from decades past, others more recent. All of them had the same pale, knowing look, the same dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of sorrow and rage. "Sarah," Jacob said, not taking his eyes off the girl in the white dress. "Can you see them?" But when he looked around, Sarah and the other detectives were gone. The cabin was exactly as it had been in 2006, intact, furnished, alive with the promise of summer adventures. Through the windows, Jacob could see Camp Pine Hollow in its heyday, with children playing on the lakeshore and counselors leading activities. "This is how it really is," the girl said, following his gaze. "This is how it's always been. The camp never closed. The children never left. They just changed perspective." Jacob felt a deep terror settling in his bones. "What do you want?" "From me? What we've always wanted. For you to join us. To be part of our eternal summer. Our endless games." She gestured to the other children. "Look at them, Jacob. They're happy here. They never have to grow up, never have to face the disappointments of adult life. They never have to be alone." And for a moment, Jacob was tempted. The promise of eternal childhood, of never having to face the complexities and sorrows of growing up, was seductive. These children would never know heartbreak, never face the death of parents, never struggle with mortgages and job stress, and the thousand small tragedies of adult life. But then he thought of his wife, of his own children waiting for him at home, of the life he'd built despite the shadows that had haunted him. "No," he said firmly. "I have a life, a real life. People who love me." The girl's expression darkened. "People who will leave you, just like everyone else. People who will grow old and die and abandon you to loneliness. We offer forever, Jacob. We offer family that will never disappoint you. Forever isn't worth it if it's not real." The girl in the white dress hissed, and for a moment her facade dropped completely. Jacob saw something ancient and hungry, something that had been feeding on children's souls for centuries. Her white dress became tattered and stained, her pale skin turned gray and mottled, her dark hair writhed like snakes. "You think you can just walk away again?" she snarled. "You think you can come back to our sacred ground and leave unchanged? You belong to us, Jacob Foster. You've always belonged to us." The other children began to move closer, their faces twisted with an inhuman hunger. Jacob backed toward the door, but it slammed shut before he could reach it. The windows went dark, as if night had fallen in an instant. "We gave you 18 years of freedom," the girl continued, her voice now a chorus of whispers. 18 years to live your little life, to pretend you were normal. But you were never normal, were you? You always felt different, always felt like you were missing something. That's because part of you stayed here with us." Jacob felt the truth of her words like a physical blow. He had always felt incomplete, always felt like he was watching his own life from the outside. His relationships had been good, but not great. His career successful, but not fulfilling. He'd gone through the motions of living without ever feeling truly alive. The shoes were just the beginning, the girl said, her form shifting between child and monster. "Every night, in your dreams, you came back to us. Every night, you walked these paths and played our games. Part of your soul has been here all along, growing stronger, more connected to us." Jacob realized with horror that she was right. His dreams, his nightmares, his strange obsession with the forest, it had all been real. He had been visiting this place in his sleep, feeding the connection between himself and the girl in the white dress. "And now," she continued, "it's time for the rest of you to join us." The children pressed closer, their hands reaching for him. Jacob could feel their cold touch, could sense the void that existed where their souls should be. They were going to drag him down into that darkness, make him one of them, add his essence to their eternal collection. But just as their fingers brushed his skin, a new voice cut through the supernatural gloom. "Jacob, where are you?" It was Sarah, calling from somewhere outside the cabin. The real Sarah, not the phantom from his memories. Her voice was like a lifeline, a connection to the world of the living. The girl in the white dress spun around, her face contorting with rage. Impossible. She shouldn't be able to see Jacob. Sarah's voice came again, closer now. "The cabin's on fire. We need to get you out." "Fire?" Jacob looked around the cabin, and suddenly he could see it, flames licking at the walls, smoke billowing from the roof. The supernatural scene was beginning to waver, like a mirage in the desert heat. "It's an illusion," he realized. "None of this is real." "It's all real," the girl snarled. "This is the true reality. Everything else is the illusion." But Jacob was already moving, pushing through the circle of ghostly children. They grasped at him, their cold fingers leaving trails of ice on his skin, but he kept moving. He had to get to Sarah, had to get back to the real world. The door, which had been sealed shut, suddenly burst open. Through the smoke and flames, Jacob could see Sarah's silhouette, her hand outstretched toward him. "Come on," she shouted. "The whole structure is going to collapse." Jacob ran for the door, but the girl in the white dress was faster. She appeared directly in front of him, her form now fully monstrous, a writhing mass of shadows and teeth and hungering void. "You cannot leave us again," she hissed. "We will not let you go." "Watch me," Jacob said, and dove through her insubstantial form. He hit the ground hard, rolling in the dirt and leaves outside the cabin. The real world crashed back into focus, the sound of crackling flames, the smell of smoke, the feeling of Sarah's hands pulling him to safety. "Are you hurt?" Sarah asked, helping him to his feet. "You were in there for almost 10 minutes. We kept calling, but you didn't respond." Jacob looked back at the cabin, which was indeed on fire, apparently, from some old electrical wiring that had finally given up the ghost. The flames were consuming the structure rapidly, and he could see the crime scene investigators retreating to a safe distance. "The evidence," he said. "The shoes, the symbol. We got everything," Sarah assured him. "All the evidence is safe. But what happened in there? You looked like you were in some kind of trance." Jacob watched the cabin burn, the flames reaching higher into the gray sky. For just a moment, he thought he saw faces in the smoke, the girl in the white dress, Emma, all the other children. But then the wind shifted, and they were gone. "I remembered," he said quietly. "I remembered what really happened that summer." Over. The next several hours, as the fire department extinguished the blaze and the investigators processed the scene, Jacob told Sarah everything. The girl in the white dress, the visions, the dreams that had haunted him for 18 years. The supernatural. Encounter in the burning cabin. Sarah listened without judgment, taking notes and asking careful questions. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You know," she said finally, "I always felt like there was something I was missing that summer. Something important that I couldn't quite remember. And after you left, I started having dreams. About the forest, about children calling for help. You felt it too? I think we all did, to some degree. But you were the one she really wanted. The one who could see her clearly." Sarah looked at the smoldering remains of the cabin. "I think burning this place was the right thing to do. Sometimes the only way to break a cycle is to destroy what feeds it." But Jacob wasn't so sure. As they drove away from the site, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd only won a temporary victory. The girl in the white dress was old, older than the camp, older than the town. She'd been collecting children for generations, and she wasn't going to give up just because her favorite hiding place had been destroyed. That night, in his hotel room in Salem, Jacob called his wife. "How did it go?" Lisa asked. "Did you get the closure you were looking for?" "I think so," Jacob said, though he wasn't entirely sure. "I'll be home tomorrow. The kids miss you." Tommy asked why you had to go back to your old camp. "What did you tell him?" "That sometimes grown-ups have to face things from their childhood to fully let them go." Jacob smiled, thinking of his 8-year-old son. That's not far from the truth. But as he hung up the phone, Jacob felt a familiar chill. The hotel room suddenly seemed too quiet, too empty. He looked toward the window, where the curtains were, drawn tight against the night. Slowly, he walked over and pulled them back. There, standing in the parking lot 3 stories below, was the girl in the white dress. She was looking up at his window, and even from this distance, he could see her smile. Then she raised her hand and waved, just like Emma had done 18 years ago. And Jacob realized that this wasn't over. It would never be over. The girl in the white dress had been patient for 18 years. She could be patient for 18 more, but she would never stop trying to collect him. Jacob closed the curtains and turned away from the window. He would go home to his family, return to his life, try to forget what he'd seen. But he knew he would never truly escape the forests of Oregon, the girl in the white dress, or the eternal summer where lost children played games that never ended. Some connections, once made, could never be broken, and some debts could never be paid. The flight home was turbulent, but Jacob barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the events at Camp Pine Hollow over and over. The burning cabin, the girl in the white dress, the realization that he'd been carrying a piece of that dark place with him for 18 years. Lisa was waiting for him at Portland International Airport, her face lighting up when she saw him emerge from the jetway. "You look terrible," she said, wrapping him in a hug. "Are you okay?" "Just tired," Jacob said, though he knew it was more than that. He felt hollowed out, like something essential had been carved away from him. "Where are the kids?" "At my mom's." "I thought we should talk before they come home." They drove through the familiar streets of Portland in relative silence. Jacob found himself studying every shadow, every tree, every patch of darkness where something might be hiding. He knew it was irrational. The girl in the white dress was tied to the forests of Oregon, to the specific place where Camp Pine Hollow had stood. But rationality had little power over the fear that had taken root in his chest. At home, Lisa made coffee, and they sat in the kitchen. The same kitchen where Jacob had eaten breakfast 18 years ago, before leaving for camp. The morning light streamed through the windows, making everything seem normal and safe. "Tell me, what happened?" Lisa said gently. All of it, so Jacob told her. Not the edited version he'd planned, not the sanitized account that would protect her from the worst of it. He told her everything. The girl in the white dress, the supernatural encounter in the cabin, the realization that he'd been psychically connected to that place for nearly 2 decades. Lisa listened without interruption, her expression growing more concerned with each detail. When he finished, she reached across the table and took his hand. "I believe you," she said simply. "You do?" "Jacob, I've been married to you for 8 years. I know when you're telling the truth. And I know you've been carrying something heavy all this time. Something that made you wake up screaming some nights, something that made you avoid camping trips with the kids." Jacob felt tears welling up in his eyes. "I was so afraid you'd think I was crazy." "Maybe you are a little crazy," Lisa said with a small smile. "But you're my crazy, and I love you." They held each other for a long time, and for the first time in days, Jacob felt a measure of peace. Whatever was hunting him, whatever dark force had marked him as its own, he wouldn't face it alone. But that peace was short-lived. That evening, as they were preparing dinner, Jacob's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but something about it made his blood run cold. "Hello?" He answered hesitantly. "Jacob Foster?" The voice was young, maybe 10 or 11 years old. A girl's voice. "Who is this?" "You know who this is." The voice was sweet, innocent, but underneath it Jacob could hear something else, something ancient and hungry. "You left us again, Jacob. That wasn't very nice." Jacob's hand was shaking as he held the phone. "How did you get this number?" "I know lots of things, Jacob. I know where you live. I know about your wife, your children. I know about Tommy and Sarah, your little boy and girl." "Stay away from them," Jacob said, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't want to hurt them, Jacob. I just want you to come home. Come back to the forest where you belong." "I'm not coming back." "Oh, but you are." The girl's voice was changing, becoming layered with other voices. Emma's voice, the voices of all the children she'd collected over the years. "You see, Jacob, you've been marked. You've been ours since that first summer, and we always collect what belongs to us. I'm not afraid of you anymore. You should be. Because this time, we're not waiting for you to come to us. This time, we're coming to you." The line went dead. Jacob stared at the phone, his mind racing. The girl in the white dress had never left the forest before. She was tied to that place, bound by whatever dark magic had created her. But if she was telling the truth, if she was somehow expanding her reach ... double quotes, Jacob? Lisa was standing in the doorway, concern written across her face. "What's wrong?" "We need to leave," Jacob said, already moving toward the stairs. "Now. Tonight." "What?" "Why? Because she's coming. The girl from the forest. She's coming for me, and I won't let her hurt you or the kids." Lisa followed him upstairs as he threw clothes into a suitcase. "Where are we going to go?" "I don't know. Somewhere far from here. Somewhere she can't find us." But even as he spoke, Jacob knew it was futile. The girl in the white dress had been patient for 18 years. She could be patient for 18 more. And she had resources now. All the children she'd collected, all the souls she'd consumed. She could reach anywhere, touch anyone. They were packing in frantic silence when the lights went out. The house plunged into darkness, and Jacob felt his blood turn to ice. Outside, the streetlights were still on. This was just their house, just their power. "Stay close to me," Jacob whispered to Lisa. "Don't let go of my hand." They crept downstairs in the darkness, Jacob leading the way with his phone's flashlight. The house felt different somehow, larger, colder, as if they were walking through a vast cavern instead of their familiar home. And then they heard it, the sound of children laughing, coming from the living room. Jacob's flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing a sight that made his knees go weak. The girl in the white dress was sitting on their couch, surrounded by the ghostly forms of her collected children. Emma was there, along with dozens of others, all of them pale and still and wrong. "Hello, Jacob," the girl said, her voice echoing in the confined space. "We've come to take you home." "You can't be here," Jacob said, his voice shaking. "You're bound to the forest. You can't leave." "Rules change," the girl replied. "Boundaries shift. We've been feeding on your dreams for 18 years, Jacob. Growing stronger, learning new ways to reach across the veil. And now we're strong enough to come anywhere we want." The ghostly children began to move, rising from their positions and gliding toward Jacob and Lisa. Jacob could feel their cold presence, could sense the void that existed where their souls should be. "Run," he whispered to Lisa. "Get out of here." But Lisa shook her head. "I'm not leaving you." "How touching," the girl in the white dress said. "But it doesn't matter. You're both coming with us now. And your children, too, when we collect them. From grandmother's house." "No," Jacob said, stepping forward. "Take me if you want, but leave them alone." "Oh, Jacob, it doesn't work that way. You see, when someone is marked by us, everyone they love becomes part of the collection. It's how we grow, how we expand our family." The ghostly children were almost upon them now, their cold hands reaching out. Jacob could feel their touch, could sense the emptiness that would consume him if they succeeded in dragging him into their realm. But then Lisa did something unexpected. She stepped forward, directly into the path of the approaching spirits. "I don't know what you are," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "But I know what love is. And I know that love is stronger than whatever darkness you represent." A girl in the white dress laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Love? Love is what doomed all these children, Jacob. Love is what made them vulnerable, what made them easy to collect. Love is weakness." "No," Lisa said firmly. "Love is strength. And my love for Jacob, his love for me and our children, that's what's going to send you back to whatever hell you crawled out of." She reached out and took Jacob's hand, and immediately he felt it. A warmth, a connection, a power that had nothing to do with the supernatural forces swirling around him. It was human love, pure and simple, and it was stronger than any dark. Magic. The ghostly children recoiled from that warmth, their forms becoming less solid, more translucent. The girl in the white dress snarled, her beautiful facade dropping away to reveal the monster beneath. "You think your pathetic human emotions can stop us?" she hissed. "We are eternal." "We are. You're alone," Jacob said, understanding flooding through him. "That's what you really are. You're alone, and you've been alone for so long that you've forgotten what real connection feels like. That's why you collect children, because you're desperate for companionship, for family, for love." The girl's monstrous form wavered, and, for a moment, Jacob saw her as she truly was, not an ancient evil, but a lost child who had died centuries ago and had been trying to fill the void in her soul ever since. But what you offer isn't love, Jacob continued. It's just more loneliness, more emptiness. That's why none of your collected children ever seem truly happy. They're just as alone as you are. Stop, the girl whispered, her voice now purely that of a frightened child. Stop talking. I feel sorry for you, Jacob said, and he meant it. I understand why you wanted me to stay, but I can't. I have a real family, real love, and that's something you can never take away from me. The girl in the white dress let out a wail of anguish that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The ghostly children began to fade, their forms dissolving like smoke in the wind. The supernatural cold that had filled the room was replaced by the normal warmth of their home. We will find you, the girl said as she too began to fade. We will never stop looking for you. I know, Jacob said sadly, but I won't be afraid anymore, because now I know what I'm fighting for. The girl in the white dress gave him one last look, not of hatred, but of profound sadness. Then she was gone, taking her collection of lost souls with her. The lights came back on, and Jacob and Lisa found themselves standing in their ordinary living room, holding hands and breathing hard. Is it over? Lisa asked. Jacob thought about that question for a long moment. The girl in the white dress was still out there, still hunting, still collecting. She would probably try to reach him again, in dreams or visions or moments of weakness. But something fundamental had changed tonight. He was no longer just a victim of her power. He was someone who had chosen love over fear, connection over isolation. I don't think it will ever be completely over, he said honestly, but I think we won. 3 months later, Jacob was working in his home office when he received another call from Detective Sarah Chun. Jacob, I wanted to let you know, we've had some interesting developments in the Camp Pine Hollow case. What kind of developments? Well, after the cabin burned down, we started getting reports from other locations. Old summer camps, abandoned buildings, places where children had gone missing over the years. And we've been finding more of these. Buried collections, shoes, toys, personal items. Jacob felt a chill run down his spine. She's been doing this for a long time, hasn't she? Decades. Maybe centuries. We've found evidence going back to the 1800s. But here's the interesting part. All the activity seems to have stopped about 3 months ago, right around the time you had your encounter. Stopped? No new disappearances, no new sightings. It's like whatever was doing this just gave up. Jacob thought about the girl in the white dress, about the look of sadness in her eyes as she'd faded away. Maybe she finally found what she was looking for. What do you mean? Maybe she finally understood the difference between taking love and earning it. After he hung up, Jacob sat in his office for a long time thinking. Through the window, he could see his children playing in the backyard. Tommy, now 9, and Sarah 7. They were laughing, running, fully alive in a way that the girl's collected children never could be. Lisa came in and sat on the edge of his desk. Penny, for your thoughts? Just thinking about the case. About how sometimes the monsters we fear are just lost children who forgot how to love. Do you think she's at peace now? Jacob considered that. I hope so. I think maybe she finally learned that you can't fill the emptiness inside you by taking from others. You have to give something of yourself. That night, for the first time, in 18 years, Jacob slept without dreaming of the forest. And in the morning, he woke up feeling truly free. But in the deep woods of Oregon, in places where the boundary between worlds grows thin, some say you can still hear the sound of awe. Children playing. Not the hollow laughter of the lost and collected, but the genuine joy of souls who have finally found their way home. The girl in the white dress walks those woods still, but she is no longer hunting. She is searching for something else now. Not children to collect, but a way to heal the wounds that turned her into a monster. And sometimes, on quiet summer nights, she can almost remember what it felt like to be human. The shoes, those bright blue sneakers that had started it all, were eventually returned to Jacob. He kept them in a box in his closet, a reminder of how close he'd come to losing everything that mattered. But they were just shoes now, with no power over him, because Jacob had learned the most important lesson of all, that love, real love, is not something that can be taken or stolen or collected. It can only be given freely, and it grows stronger when it's shared. And in the end, that was the only magic that mattered. 10 years later, Jacob Foster stood at the edge of a different forest, watching his son Tommy prepare for his first week at summer camp. Tommy was 18 now, confident and capable, nothing like the shy, bookish boy Jacob had been at that age. "You? Sure you're okay with this?" Tommy asked, shouldering his backpack. "I know you had some bad experiences at camp." Jacob smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "I'm fine. Just ... be careful. Pay attention to your instincts. And remember that you can. Always come home if you need to." "I will, Dad. I love you." "I love you too, son." As Tommy joined his group and headed into the woods, Jacob felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. But it was just the normal worry of a parent watching his child take another step toward independence. The supernatural terror that had once consumed him was gone, replaced by something much healthier, the knowledge that love was stronger than fear, and that some connections could never be broken. He was about to turn away when he caught a glimpse of something in the trees. A flash of white, barely visible among the shadows. Jacob tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for his phone. But as he looked closer, he realized it wasn't the girl in the white dress. It was just a counselor in a white t-shirt, helping a young camper who had dropped his water bottle. Jacob laughed at himself, shaking his head. Some fears died hard, but they did die. He climbed back into his car and drove home to Lisa and Sarah, back to his real life, his real family, his real love. Behind him, the forest settled into its ancient quiet, holding its secrets close. And somewhere in those depths, a girl in a white dress paused in her eternal wandering and smiled. She was still learning what love meant. But she was learning and that, perhaps, was enough.